all of those are things where, working class voters are still more progressive than middle class voters. Middle class voters are also really progressive on almost all of those things as well. And in fact, there are some issues like, say, support for unions, where we found middle class voters today are actually just as supportive as working class voters, or support for a jobs guarantee, for instance.
Hey, it's Jordan with Status Coup.
This is Ashley with Status Coup.
On the ground.
In Philadelphia.
Flint, Michigan. East Palestine, Ohio. Please support the leading independent news outlet on the ground,
covering what the corporate media covers up. Hey, this is Ashley Bishop with Status Coup. I am very excited to be joined today by Jared Abbott, the director of the Center for Working Class Politics, which just came out with a really interesting study on working class voters and where they stand on some very key issues. So Jared, thank you so much for being here. Before we get to the study, which again, I think has some very interesting results, can you give viewers some background on the Center for Working Class Politics? What is the organization and what does it do?
Sure. Well, it's great to be here with you. I really appreciate the invite. We are a small research collective of political scientists, labor researchers, and we came together after 2020 to try to understand, what happened with Bernie, and how can we move forward with a Bernie-style economic populist coalition, in future elections. And so since then, we've been doing research to try to answer that question. And we do all kinds of different stuff, surveys of different kinds, and we collect data, statistical data, and other kinds of data about how candidates message on the campaign trail. And we use all of that stuff, and we do interviews with all kinds of different voters and politicians. And we try to use all this information to provide reports, strategic insights into how, broadly speaking, economic populism, can help to build a stronger, more robust and sustainable, progressive coalition going forward. So that's basically what all of our work is sort of centered around.
Yeah, I mean, that's all really interesting. Obviously, there are plenty of organizations that try to figure out, how to advance a political, ideology, and focus on the things that we think voters want, but there aren't any that focus specifically on what working class voters want. So it's very interesting, that is the focus of what you guys are doing, and not just working class voters, but, working class voters and thinking about economic populism and all of those different kinds of things. So again, super interesting. And so on to the study. This was put out in collaboration with Jacobin, and the write-up came out yesterday. And you guys looked at data going all the way back to the 1960s, which is extremely extensive. So what is it that you were looking for in this specific study?
Well, we were just kind of interested. We went out there and we saw that there haven't been, obviously there's a lot of polling that you can see on all kinds of different things that's available, but we haven't really seen a more or less comprehensive just sort of breakdown of, okay, well, just how conservative, if they are working class voters, how does that compare to, sort of middle class voters? There's a lot of things being thrown about, claims on social media and in the press about how working class voters are so reactionary, and they're just holding back progressive politicians from being able to run on the robust sort of lefty progressive standpoint that they want to, and some people even claiming that the working class is more conservative on economic issues than middle class voters, which hasn't been sort of our experience. And we wanted to kind of look at this more intensively, and also to sort of look at it over time. And so we just found these sort of gold standard academic surveys that are used by a lot of political scientists and commentators. But we went back and found public opinion questions from these surveys about a whole range of issues: economic, social, cultural. And we sort of tracked the evolution of working class attitudes over time to sort of see, basically, are working class voters as conservative as they're sort of portrayed in the media? And have they become more conservative over time? And, our sort of thinking was, there's a lot of voters that sort of switched from, say, Obama to Trump in 2016. Did those people become, just rabid reactionaries in the intervening years, or sort of what's going on there? And so we sort of leveraged all of these sort of hundreds of opinion questions to sort of get a look at that, gain some leverage on that question, because we hadn't really seen anything that comprehensive, data driven wise that was accomplishing that goal.
Yeah. And I think it's a really important thing to look at, because as you're saying, a lot of assumptions are made about this, specific group of workers. And if you of working people and of working class voters. And if you watch any kind of media, if you're, watching MSNBC or Fox, like you're going to hear the same kind of things, that, these working class voters are necessarily more conservative on most issues. And that idea is very much taken for granted. So it's really interesting that you guys actually drilled down and looked, going as far back as you did at, no, are they actually though? Because we don't know. We hear this a lot, but we don't really know. So I am very curious, what results did you guys find? Were you surprised by what you found after going through this like extensive, trove of data?
Yeah, no, I mean, I wasn't that surprised because what we found sort of confirmed what my priors sort of were, that in fact, working class people have economic self-interest that makes them, obviously not across the board, but sort of on average, more likely to support policies that would make their economic lives better. That's not to say, the one thing that I think was surprising, which is really interesting and actually, has lots of different implications, but some of which are pretty positive for sort of building a majoritarian working class and progressive coalition in the United States, is that actually, middle class voters have become a lot more progressive on not just social and cultural issues, which I expected to find, but also on economic issues. So that, one thing we found, I think a key takeaway is that, yes, almost across the board, working class voters today are still more progressive on economic issues, be they, everything from supporting a higher minimum wage to, supporting protections for American workers so that they don't lose their jobs to offshoring or outsourcing or automation, to things like, supporting expanded spending for Social Security and Medicare. All of those are things where, working class voters are still more progressive than middle class voters. And there are issues where Democrats and progressives clearly need to be focusing their attention. But that said, middle class voters are also really progressive on almost all of those things as well. And in fact, there are some issues like, say, support for unions, where we found middle class voters today are actually just as supportive as working class voters, or support for a jobs guarantee, for instance, is something where we don't really see any difference in support between middle class and working class voters. So those are areas where, even though there's high levels of support for working class among working class voters, we don't really see a trade-off in terms of these issues being seen as too extreme or too costly, say, to middle class taxpayers. So that's really positive. And the other thing that we saw with respect to social and cultural issues is that, yes, working class voters are more conservative in absolute terms than middle class voters, basically in terms of everything, most things you could think of in terms of immigration policy, abortion, guns, the environment, things like that. But that's always been the case. And there's not like there's been some big change that's happened since Obama or since the 2000s, which has made these people, these voters so much more conservative, so that they needed to find some, reactionary, like Donald Trump, who wanted to send us, culturally back to the Stone Age. No, these folks are still quite progressive, and in fact, they're not. They haven't become any more conservative. And in fact, our study shows that on many issues, including on immigration, including on abortion, including on all these other social issues that we looked at, working class voters, while they haven't become as liberal or progressive as quickly or as strongly as middle class voters, who are more and more college educated, they have become relatively more progressive to their own positions 20 or 30 years ago. which is not conclusive evidence, obviously, but it does sort of suggest like, okay, well, working class voters today are more progressive than the same group of voters in 2008 who elected the first African-American president in the United States. So is it really so crazy to think that given their relative, okay, not progressivism, but moderation on these cultural and social issues, that if they had a really robust program of economic populism being offered by progressives, that, you know, the social and cultural stuff would sort of cancel all that out? I don't really think so.
I think that that's all really fascinating. And, you know, as you're saying, you mentioned that, you know, this group of voters, they are actually more progressive than they were in, as you said, 2008, on some of the some of Trump's key issues on immigration, on abortion rights, on all of those kinds of things. So it's really fascinating that, you know, even on those issues, they become more progressive. And that, you know, it feels kind of counter to what we're seeing right now. So again, that's all very interesting. Was there anything else within the study that you looked at that you think is noteworthy, or you think is just interesting to point out?
Yeah, well, I mean, drilling down more into sort of, okay, well, working class voters aren't quite as conservative as people think they are. Okay, well, that's promising. They're not only sort of more progressive on many social and cultural issues than they were 20 years ago, but there's also some specific issues where, you know, they've actually gain ground with respect to middle class voters in terms of progressivism on certain types of cultural issues, especially ones related to sort of protecting the rights of all, right, and sort of basic civil liberties and basic sort of freedoms, individual freedoms. Working class voters have, you know, expressed quite moderate and sometimes even progressive positions. But that doesn't mean that any of these are working class voters who voted for Trump who could actually be winnable, right? And so we wanted to look more specifically at, well, you know, let's now drill down into Trump voters in particular and see, well, you know, what percentage of those have these characteristics of, you know, being economic progressively, so that sort of Bernie style appeals might be, might be something that they could connect with and find really appealing, but also are not so conservative on social and cultural issues that we could sort of, it would be hard to imagine that they would still vote for a Democrat if they held extremely conservative views on abortion or immigration or other, you know, highly salient social issues. And so what we did was we drilled down into the 2020 Trump electorate, and we found that, you know, not shockingly, not a huge percentage of those people, fit the criteria of being progressive economically while also sort of moderate socially. But we did find, you know, something like 20% of the 2020 Bernie electorate could be considered, at least economically, sort of like Bernie bros, right? People that were, you know, for a higher minimum wage, people that were for, you know, government provided health insurance or increased public spending on schools or Social Security, or for a tax on millionaires. There are these bundles of policies that were supported by, you know, 20 or so percent of Trump voters. And of those, a half or so of them also had pretty moderate views on social issues. So that even though it's a pretty small group of voters in terms of the entire electorate, we're talking about, you know, a potentially decisive slice of the overall electorate, especially in working class heavy swing states that are obviously really important to win to beat Republicans, like in Michigan or in Pennsylvania, where, you know, the number of Trump voters who were both sort of economically progressive or populist and also pretty moderate on social issues, was more than enough in terms of its size of the electorate to, you know, be decisive in elections in these swing states. So we think sort of following from that, and especially in 2024, when we don't have all the analysis in yet, but, you know, many of the Trump voters in 2024 were even more weakly connected to, you know, the Republican Party and Trump, especially sort of like Latino male voters that sort of have moved over to Trump because, you know, they're just sort of worried about inflation, or they feel like the Democrats aren't doing anything for them, you know. So potentially the 2024 electorate of the Republicans is even larger in terms of this group that could be thought of as, you know, economically progressive and socially moderate. And so this sort of gives us hope that, we shouldn't just abandon these folks. We should try to persuade them, and we should try to, show them that progressives actually have something that's going to make their lives better, and that they're not so out of touch on, social and cultural issues that working class voters are just going to sort of say, no, thank you, out of the gate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's all incredibly fascinating. And I have a couple of follow-ups that I would want to ask about that. I guess one, I would ask, where do you think this idea that working class people are inherently more conservative actually start? Where does this idea kind of come from?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, it goes back, quite a long ways. There's some, extent to which, the increasing centrality of highly educated urban voters in the Democratic electorate, which we've seen over the past 10 or 20 years, means that there's not necessarily a bias, although I think there certainly is some bias. There are some Democrats who just will say, pretty, blatantly, discriminatory things about working class voters or people from the heartland, so to speak. So I do think that does exist, and you certainly hear that on liberal media sometimes. Just a disdain for working class people, or like Hillary's basket of deplorables, was a good example of that. So I think there is just a kind of a bias, just like I think in the political class in general, there's a bias toward working class people. Like how many working class people do you see in Congress? Like 2%, if that. We've talked with people that have run for office and with a working class background, and they feel like sometimes they're treated like as lesser than, or that they don't have the the skills or the training or the social, graces or whatever to be, considered on the par with sort of people with a more elite background. And so I think that's part of it. And I think that, there's also a kind of a sense of, you guys sort of made your bed with Trump, and you should, stop complaining and wake up to the fact that you're just voting against your self-interest, right? And the story, to some degree, that's hard to deny, because many people are voting for a person who's going to be like this big beautiful bill, actually hurting them economically. But obviously the story about why people vote for certain characters, certain people, is much more complicated than something as simple as that. And so that kind of condescension, that kind of sort of just unwillingness to, open up and try to empathize with people, that you might disagree with pretty heavily, but who, might have some reasons for making the decisions that they do. And if you actually took those reasons to heart, you might actually be much more effective in reaching them politically, not to mention, any other positive effects that might have. So I think that that's probably a big part of the story. Also media, right? It's something where people's narratives are sort of reinforced, and their sort of most negative biases or their most negative like presuppositions about people very different than them just get reconfirmed and reinforced and supported, as they're sort of in a media bubble. And then when you sort of layer on top of that the fact that working class people and middle class people just don't like live in the same spaces, right? In general, right? And there used to be, obviously, Robert Putnam and others have written a lot about this. People of different classes used to work, be involved in social organizations and civic clubs and things like that. And the social fabric that we used to have, or that was there for, some people in the country, in the post-war era, it's just basically evaporating. And so you don't really have spaces for people, across classes, or certainly across partisanship, to even being in the same spaces. And so that also, I think, reinforces the sort of negative stereotypes that people have. And obviously Republicans and many working class Trump supporters have the same sorts of biases against middle class people and college educated people, which are also completely unfair. But it certainly does work, in that way that I'm suggesting, I think. And that's a big problem in terms of, finding more thoughtful and creative and ultimately successful ways for progressives to build the coalitions that they need to stop, Trump, and to actually have something that will help working people, in this country.
Yeah, that's all fascinating, and I want to get I took us on a little bit of a detour from the actual study
Okay.
itself, and I do want to follow up on some of that. But as far as the study itself goes, is there anything else that you can say about this kind of working class voters just becoming more progressive over time? Do we know why that's happening? Do we have any kind of guesses as to why that would happen? Anything else that you would want to say about that?
Yeah, well, we can't say anything from the actual report about why that's happening because that's not something that we really delved into. This was just sort of like a descriptive, like, let's just show the lay of the land here. But of course, there are a lot of theories about why that's happening, some of which are, kind of structural, like basically across the sort of industrialized world. You see that as industrialized democracies mature, their electorates just become generally more progressive over time, and part of that's driven by education. That as you see a higher percentage of the population getting a higher level of education, that's often correlated with with more progressive values. And also generationally, we're just sort of seeing, each subsequent generation having, holding more progressive values than the one before it. And so we're also seeing that with respect to, sort of Gen Z and the millennials compared to, Gen X and the boomers, and obviously the silent generation, and the greatest generation. And so I think that's kind of a big part of it. And then also I think that, there have been there were battles fought right around many of these issues, and in terms of feminism and in terms of the LGBT rights movements or the sort of gay rights movements, and and environmentalism that sort of played out over the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And even though we've seen a backlash, in many ways across many of those fronts, and especially some scary stuff like something like there's been a huge drop in the percentage of Republican men who say that, women's place is outside the home since 2016. So we actually are seeing some pretty significant like regressions, and actually sort of support for gay rights is actually sort of declining a little bit over time, and trans rights significantly. So we are sort of seeing some backlash, I think, largely because of Trump getting elected, and then sort of having this sort of a way of framing the issues that's, is creating these wedge issues, and also lots of other reasons, but basically I think over time the effects of all these different movements starting in the 60s just sort of has had the effect of transforming our culture in ways that make the average person somewhat more liberal over time, but of course it also eventually, if you push those movements in directions that people feel are too far away from their own experience, then that can also, or you don't frame them in a way that people can understand, then, or that they feel they're being condescended to, or whatever, like some people feel Democrats have done, then you get these sort of backlashes that we're talking about. So it does seem a little bit dissonant. Like we're seeing like this super reactionary Republican Party at the same time as working class people are becoming more liberal. But I actually think that that's sort of both of them are happening at the same time.
That's really interesting, and you kind of brought the conversation over to Democrats as well. It would seem to me that this is a pretty good indictment on the Democrats and their idea that they just need to message better to voters. They need to message better to working class voters. It's not anything material that working class voters are looking for. It's just, they want to drill down on democracy dies in darkness, all of these very like nebulous ideas where, again, this study would seem to indicate that actually, no, working class voters are looking for material things.
Yeah, without a doubt. And plus when you look at questions on surveys about, well, what are the things that you care about the most, right? It's like always economics comes first, right? And even when immigration is something that's like high up on people's lists, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that however sort of incorrect their interpretation may be empirically, there is a sense in which many working class people that have more reactionary or conservative views on immigration sometimes are thinking about those issues in terms of their own economic security and concern. So even if immigrants are not taking the jobs of native born Americans, which, on average is not the case, that doesn't mean that people aren't reading that issue through an economic lens. And if Democrats were able to put forward some other set of policies that working class voters could look at and see, oh my gosh, these folks are actually going to be able to deliver for me and to sort of help to turn around decades of decline and, basically stagnating standards of living in my community, then maybe I'd be open to voting for them again. And I think that that's definitely, a big part of the story. Democrats do need to message better too. I think that is real, and they need to stop talking down to working class people and to voters in general. And they need to focus. You can focus on economic issues in government, like actually the Biden administration did, but they didn't message very well, right? And so the Biden administration, some of the reason why we're getting this backlash is because of inflation and, the fact that these bills that the Biden administration passed, did have these sort of short-term pain associated with them for all of us in terms of how much things cost. Although, of course, those policies were not the only reason why inflation happened, to be sure. But on the other hand, it's also true that Biden and his administration did a lot of things that were pretty good in terms of, industrial policy and trying to reinvest in sort of left behind communities to a degree that we haven't seen for decades. But they were really bad at creating a broad narrative about what they're doing for working people, right? About trying to inspire a sense of we actually have your backs. We understand that you're suffering. We understand that you've had a rough deal for decades and decades, and we're here to turn that around. And Trump, even though he doesn't do anything to help working people, he's been, especially in 2016, really effective at having the message I'm here. I hear you. I know what you're going through. I'm tired of it too. And so the Democrats, they need both better messaging that connects with people and shows that Democrats care, and also the policies. And not just campaigning on the policies, but the biggest problem that Democrats have is that they need to actually implement policies that people can feel and then begin to trust the Democratic Party again. And they can only do that if they have power and if they are able to implement laws that people can really feel and see their material lives improving. So that's a major uphill battle for Democrats and for progressives, but we don't have any other choice but to, try and make it happen.
Yeah, I mean, do you see that happening with the Democrats at any point? I mean, I'm looking around at kind of the political landscape of the last, let's say, 3 weeks. I live in New York City. Zoran was just elected. He just won the primary for New York City mayor, a candidate who came out of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. It seems pretty clear that he won because he offered a slate of very easy to understand policies that would affect people's material conditions. And, I've heard a lot from Democrats about, it's his social media game. It's XYZ. It's anything but the fact that he very clearly explained to people, no, here are the policies. Here's what I'm going to do for you. Again, nothing complicated, just very easy things that will improve people's material conditions. And from the Democrats, a lot of what I've been seeing over the last few weeks has been, instead of embracing, their own mantra, vote blue no matter who, we're going to back this candidate. They have done whatever they can to discredit him. So when we're talking about Democrats and needing to really show up for working class voters, and show them, as you're saying, gain back their trust and show them that they can actually do something material for them, which is what everybody wants. I don't have a lot of faith that can happen. I guess I would be curious, what can we do to have ourselves heard so that the Democrats can deliver on these things that, it seems pretty clear they need to be delivering on if they want to win this voting block back?
Yeah, obviously that's the $60 million question. I mean, it is unclear whether or not the Democrats in general will be able to or willing to make the kinds of changes that they would need to in order to deliver for working people in the way that you and I are talking about, that they need to, both for the sake of our social democratic, hopefully future as a country, a country that's humane and works on behalf of ordinary people, but also just from a political stance of like stopping this shit that's happening with our democracy and authoritarian populism on the right. We need to find a way to make this work. And can they do that? I don't know. You're right. Those signs that we've been seeing with Zoran are not great. Some of that's being motivated, I think, by a reasonable concern that we don't want to think that a candidate just like Zoran could also win in Akron, because the electorate's quite different there. But the general specific point of focusing on bread and butter economics, I think, is a thing that can be generalized, right? Like, okay, maybe the specific economic policies are going to be different in Nebraska or in, Arizona or Texas or whatever. But the basic idea is, yes, find the economic issues that people care about, which in New York are different than they are in many other parts of the country. But Zoran was focusing on the ones that people care about in New York. People responded to that. And, he was very consciously, able to sort of put on the back burner things that he knew were going to sort of get in the way in terms of that economic message. And he did that very well. In contrast, Kamala Harris, she started her campaign, I'll have to say, pretty well. Like in the first week, she gave a great speech, talking about economic suffering of people, and it sounded pretty populist and everything. But then, of course, over the course of the campaign, as she got more and more, advice from her tech bro billionaire friends, she moved away from all the economics and she moved toward defend democracy. Trump is a threat to democracy, right? Trump is a threat to democracy, obviously, but that's not language that plays very well with ordinary people, because that's not something that's super concrete for folks in their mind. They want to hear about bread and butter issues, right? And so Zoran was able to do that in a way. So his non-economic issues were not, it's not like he was going to go and defend democracy. He was focusing on other social issues, but still the basic point is move away from non-economic issues, move toward economic issues, find out the things that people care about, and then present those in a way that's very relatable. And I do have to say, I think it does matter who the candidate is, right? I mean, like Tim Walz is somebody that it doesn't matter how much great stuff you put in that guy's mouth, he's not going to be very inspiring, right? Kamala Harris too. We could have made her the perfect mouthpiece, and you and I could have written her speeches and then had her speak them, and we could get Ron Howard to coach her on how to be a great speaker like he did for Biden, and still it wouldn't have worked, right? Whereas Mamdani, he's got something special, right? He's charismatic, he's got a way of relating to people, from all different walks of life. He's young, he's somebody that really kind of has that je ne sais quoi, right? So I do think that matters. But you're right that you can't have that without the material stuff as well. So in his case, he's got kind of both of those things coming together. Do other Democrats have that? It's hard to say, and especially Democrats that we need to win in places that are, really hard for Democrats to win in, so that we can try to get a majority, because Democrats can't do anything at the national level unless they have a big majority in the, in Congress. And, that's a very difficult question to think about right now. And so we need to have people like Zoran, but people that are matched to the constituencies that they're running in, who follow his lead of economics, and relate in a straightforward, a relatable way to working class voters. And we have, some examples of that happening in, some Democratic races. Somebody like Gabe Vasquez, I think is a great example of somebody that kind of fits that model in a swing state. We have Dan Osborne, ran for president or for Senate in Nebraska, and may do so again, next year against Joni. Oh my gosh, what's that guy's name? I forget the other senator from Nebraska. And and again, very different from Zoran, but very similar in the sense of focus on economics, try to, push all the culture war stuff, the wedge issues to the side, and be an organic, relatable person, among your constituencies. And there are Democrats that are like that, but obviously there are many that are pushing in another direction, and the donor class of the Democratic Party is not, at least a big part of it, is not on the same page as us. But I do think that the wave of economic populism is gaining some ground, is gaining some momentum, and hopefully more Democrats will see that it's in their own personal self-interest, if nothing else. If that's the only thing they care about, that even from their own selfish interests of getting reelected, that they should start to look more like the candidates that you and I are talking about. Whether they do that, or whether eventually, we'll need to have some sort of, third party or some sort of break from the Democrats at some point down the road, who knows? But at this point, we just have to keep putting the message out there and trying to build that sort of post-Bernie wave of economic populism that hopefully will finally cut through and pose a real challenge to the Republicans.
Yeah, and I guess I would say, as far as candidates matter. I would agree with that. And to me, I would think that the thing that Zoran has is that he seems pretty genuine.
Yeah,
he seems genuine when he says when he talks about trying to uplift working people. I believe that he cares. I believe that he's actually interested in doing that, and that when he gets into office, it's not going to be a complete turnaround of priorities.
Right.
I believe him. He seems authentic. I don't believe that Kamala Harris has any connection to the issues that working people are facing. To me, I think that is one of the biggest differences. If we're talking about who the candidates actually are, I think people are tired of, having someone like Kamala Harris up, running at the top of the ticket, who clearly doesn't understand what working people are going through and isn't making a huge effort to do that. Though I do agree, when she started her campaign, I thought, okay, sure, I'm going to give this a chance.
Yeah,
I'm going to give this a chance. And she's talking about, economic issues that are important to people. Fine. But, obviously that's not the way that the campaign ended. And I guess I would say I am in agreement. And I think that the project of all of this is finding candidates who are suited to the different areas that they're running in. What works in New York City is not going to work in Akron, as you said. Though I would say, like, if someone like Zoran got elected to a position in Akron, it would just indicate that that's what people in Akron want. That's what they're looking for.
Absolutely. No debate about that, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And I think Minneapolis, they just had a mayoral primary as well, and they voted in someone who ran on, essentially all the things that we're talking about. And he's an economic populist. So I think it's interesting that we do have some of these kind of candidates coming up who are running on material issues for people and who don't want to hear anymore, again, these nebulous ideas of defending democracy. And I'm in agreement. Clearly, like we are living under fascism, essentially, at this point. Obviously, we want to defend democracy, but I guess I am sympathetic to anyone who would look around and say, well, if this is what democracy is bringing me, if this is what democracy looks like in my life, I'm, unable to buy a house. I'm unable to comfortably feed my family. I'm unable to plan for the future. I'm still living paycheck to paycheck. I'm working, 1,000 hours a week and really not seeing any fruits of that labor for myself. If this is democracy, maybe I don't care to defend it. So I do have a lot of sympathy for that. And I guess it just, brings us back to the issue of materialism. And I guess I would ask, do you have anything else to say about materialism and, how the results of the study seem to indicate that is one of the most important things?
Yeah, no, I mean, just to reiterate all we've been saying, I think it's not the case that issues don't matter at all to voters, as is a pretty common mantra, even in some, parts of political science, academic political scientists believe that. I think that may show up as the case, like depending on the type of analysis that you do, but in a much deeper sense, I think that these economic issues are sort of at the core of why people are upset with the Democratic Party. That rage, that anger, is something that develops over time, and it may be transmuted or sort of transposed into a different register of sort of xenophobia or anti-immigrant attitudes or just just sort of pro-authoritarian attitudes or whatever else. And sure, there's a certain percentage of the Republicans that are just genuinely motivated by those things, sure, but there's a big percentage of Trump voters who might even seem like these terrible reactionaries, and in some ways they do hold very, very bad views that we as progressives would reject. But at the core, a lot of what people are reacting to is decades of Democratic Party mismanagement and lack of concern with working class people, and not giving people a vision and an idea of a better future for working class people, so that there's this big vacuum, there's this big political void that then the right wing, a populist authoritarian like Trump, that they can go and fill. And he's filled it really, really well. And this is not something that's only happened in the United States. This is a play. I study Latin American politics. I've seen it, in many countries, going back decades, where the mainstream parties just don't deliver for people. And then they open the door for somebody who wants to come in from the right or the left and just tear it all down. And that's what happened here. And so obviously Donald Trump bears a lot of responsibility for what we're going through, a huge amount, but the Democrats need to be aware of the role that they've played. Main reason being that if they're not aware of that, they're not going to know how to change and how to evolve. And we as progressives, in some sense, we're like the only people that can hold the Democrats accountable, right? We're the only people that in some sense can hold Trump accountable, because we're the ones that are out here, the economic populist wing of the progressive movement, saying, look, we know that working class people are pissed off because of, sort of economic grievances that have been unaddressed for so long. And that is what we need to do. That's what we need to focus on in order to, that's the root. All this other stuff is sort of is downstream from that. And unless we can address those underlying issues, we're going to be in deep trouble. Well, we are in deep trouble, even worse trouble.
Yeah. Again, I think that the study is great, and it's great that you guys looked as far back as you did. I think it's really fascinating. Anyone who hasn't taken a look, you should take a look at it. You can find it on Jacobin, the write-up of the study. Is there anything else that you would want to add? Anything else that you would want to close out this conversation with?
No, I think that's great. I mean, I've blabbered on long enough, and if anybody has any questions about the study, you can find my contact info there. Feel free to reach out. I'm always interested in a good dialogue, or any things that you feel like we should have touched on that we didn't get to, or any other ideas folks have. Would welcome them as we continue to have this really important conversation on the left.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jared. Again, everybody can find the study, the write-up of the study on jacobin.com. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for laying out the study, showing what you guys have found, and offering, a sort of optimistic view of the future from that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ashley.
Of course.